Good afternoon and welcome to the theatre at Parliament House, Canberra. We meet here today where people have met for thousands of years. So I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, pay respect to the elders past and present of all Australia's Indigenous peoples. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us in the theatre today or watching online. Welcome to the 8th annual lecture in honour of the late Harry Evans, the longest-serving clerk of the Senate. My name is Richard Payne, the current clerk of the Senate. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to members of Harry's family who have joined us for this special occasion, and to my predecessor as clerk, Dr. Rosemary Lang. Today's lecture is being live streamed and Auslan interpreted. If time permits, the series of 3 mini lectures, will be followed by a period for questions and answers. Question time. Delightful. It's my very great pleasure to introduce and welcome back to Parliament House 3 former senators, Claire Moore, Marise Payne and Rachel Siewert, to deliver the 2024 Harry Evans Lecture, Reflections on Senate Committees. Among the shaping the development of the modern Senate committee system was one of Harry's most significant achievements. Among the reforms to the committee system implemented while Harry was clerk were the routine referral of bills to committee inquiries. There was a recommendation of a committee established in 1929, implemented only 60 years later. The division of the Senate's core subject matter committees into pairs of legislation and references committees, which remains the core element of the structure of our committees today, and the distribution of chairing responsibilities for committees among different parties in the Senate, roughly in proportion to their representation, replacing a system where virtually all committees were chaired and therefore controlled by the government of the day. In 2008, Harry described the Senate's committee system as the principal means whereby the Senate obtains information bearing on the accountability of the executive. In today's lecture, our 3 speakers will draw on their wealth of committee knowledge and experience to share their reflections on the Senate committee system. Our first speaker is Claire Moore, who was a senator for Queensland from 2002 to 2019. During this time, Senator Moore served on many committees, including joint committees and Senate standing and select committees. She was the chair of the Community Affairs Committee for 7 years and also served as chair of the Select Committee on the Administration of Indigenous Affairs. Please join me in welcoming former Senator Claire Moore to share her reflections on Senate committees.
Hello everyone, and of course I share in the acknowledgement of the traditional owners, and it's great to be back in this place. It's a special joy, I think, to be sharing this with Rachel and Marise, and I don't know how do you pick from all the committees that you work on and all the people you've met, but I had a little bit of knowledge about the Senate committee before I came here because I was a public servant, and I clearly remember having to write reports for Senate estimates by ridiculous questions asked by Senator Kay Patterson when she was chair of the Senate committee about a cake in Townsville, and I was a middle-level public servant and had to write why I spent this money, and so I knew about Senate estimates. I also was a witness at an inquiry in Brisbane on the sale of Telstra, so I kind of knew a little bit. And when you come here, you really don't have a lot of say about which committee you're going to go on. There's a minor talk when you arrive in a new batch of senators. And the only thing I said was, please not economics, which was a joy both for me and the whole economic community that I never did sit on the economics committee. But what I thought I'd do was talk about 2 particular committees and also raise the point that I made a lot while I was here and have continued to make since I've gone, which is the committee system of our Senate is the most important part of what we do. It is the chance for people in the community to come and talk with their senators and to tell them what's important to them on issues that they think need change, that has impacted deeply on them, and which they hope and expect that their parliament will then take up and turn into change. And sometimes it works. And so what I'm going to talk about are two very, very different committees, and one of them Rachel and I served on, which was the ongoing issues around people who are in institutional care, which came to be known as the Forgotten Australians, which we enforced in our Senate process that they were never going to be forgotten again. And I actually did a little bit of research, as you would expect, and I saw that the wonderful Andrew Murray was actually involved in talking so much about this process. And there were a series of committees that came under a heading. The first two was one, the bringing them home for children from Aboriginal communities that were taken from their homes. And then the second one was the one on child migrants, which were relatively unknown area, but through great agitation by people who were impacted by the system, including Andrew Murray, as a senator in this place, achieved a Senate inquiry on that process, which was called the Lost Innocents. And then when I arrived onto community affairs, the first person whom I met was the redoubtable Elton Humphrey. And from then on, we had a relationship that lasted a long time, and I know everyone will talk about the value of the Secretariat and how they helped and guided and protected and effectively ensured we did our job. But this process of these three committees, which ended up with one around kids who were in institutional care, impacted greatly on every person who was part of that process. And having a quick read back on some of the evidence and also the statements of senators who were involved, there was this ongoing process about something that was evil and cruel and largely unknown, and that the people who came to give evidence to those series of committees bared their soul and were so affected by what had occurred to them and what was done to them by people who should have been protecting them was a stain on our community and was exposed by the process. So not only did community affairs keep going through those series, and the institutional care was extended a number of times. We had numerous committee hearings, over 615 submissions, many of whom were private because of the pain that was there, and came up with a range of very strong recommendations about what should occur. Mostly it was to ensure that people knew what was going on, but then they needed some response from government in terms of what would happen. And the process continued and there were discussions. And I think one of the things that just got me so much when I reread it was our committee, which personnel change, but people always share the experience. When there wasn't too much progress happening on what came out of the recommendations from the Committee on Institutional Care, the committee agreed amongst themselves that we would push to have another committee generated by the committee to look at the progress and the implementation of the recommendations from the first one. And I think that just reflected how the senators working together through their various parties could ensure that the focus was maintained on issues that were not being taken up strongly enough. And out of that process, we then achieved the apology, the national apology, which was a beautiful piece of work, and we're coming up to the 15th anniversary of that national apology next week. And I'll be with people in Brisbane that I met during the time of the committee process, where we're going to gather and remember that. We're going to a theatre and having the apology shown on screen, and then the people there will talk about how it's gone with them. We've lost way too many of them in that process. But not only did we have that process of the apology and the ongoing issues, the focus was maintained because we then had the National Museum exhibition, which was extraordinarily powerful, which is now online, so you can have a look at it. And also out of that came, as more focus continued, the Royal Commission into sexual abuse of people in institutions. I believe that that Royal Commission did not go far enough because, as people remember, Rachel being on the committee, we did not focus on sexual abuse. We focused on abuse, and what's continued on has been focused way too much, in my opinion, on, I can say that now because I've got no one to talk to, way too much on the sexual aspect. But nonetheless, the pressure kept going because of the commitment of the people who kept that pressure on the Parliament. And out of that also came the redress scheme, and there's an existing committee in this Parliament, cross-party and cross-House of Reps and Senate, which looks at the implementation of that redress scheme. And I think that shows the continuation of how a Senate process, working with community, hearing the story and exposing it, can lead to real change in action. So it just doesn't end on a shelf. And the other one I just want to mention quickly, and Richard, you've got to tell me when I'm running out of time, is one that was done by the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. It was on the Sustainable Development Goals. And if people remember anything I said, I talked a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals when I was in the Senate. And we had a committee which came up with a really strong list of recommendations, not many of which have been taken up. But nonetheless, what I want to remember is one of the great moments for me of the Senate, where we had students from the Forest School just across the road who were involved in the process themselves around the SDGs and came to give evidence to the committee. And they packed up and they walked across from Forest all together, and they sat in that large committee room where we often have large committees involving Defence Force people, and packed out with important people. And we had grade 6 students of Forest, the whole class, with their teachers and some of their selected pupils to come and talk to us about what the SDGs meant to them and how they learnt about them and how they were committed to the program. These kids were 11 at the time. The SDG process is, at this stage, is 2030. They'll be 24 when that particular process goes. Those young people talked to us about why they thought it was important and why the theme of the SDGs, leave no one behind, impacted on them and why they wanted action. And there's a small picture of that on the Senate coverage of committees, of all those kids sitting there and giving strong evidence to their senators about why that was important. And for me, that reinforces the value of the Senate committee process, because it allows people of all ages with all different opinions to come and talk to their senators and say they want change and they want their parliaments to respond to why there is a need for change. And that's why when I talk about what I miss most about this place is the opportunities of listening to the community, going to places I never would have had the chance to go, and learning about what our community expected from their parliament.
Thank you, Claire. It's very difficult for me to use Christian names, of first names of senators. I was going to say use Senator Emeritus Claire Moore, but it doesn't trip off my tongue as well as it tripped off Rosemary's tongue in past days. I'll stop rambling. Our second speaker is the Honourable Marise Payne, who was a senator for New South Wales from 1997. I'll start again. Senator for New South Wales from 1997 to 2023, becoming Australia's longest-serving female senator. Before holding a number of very senior ministerial positions, including Minister for Defence and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Senator Payne was chair of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee for more than 8 years. She served on numerous other committees, including as chair. Currently, Marise is a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Hoover Institution, a Professor of Practice in International Relations and Public Policy at Western Sydney University, and a Senior Advisor at Bondi Partners. Please join me in welcoming former Senator, the Honourable Marise Payne.
Thanks, Richard. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I am somewhat impressed to see the number of people who've joined us here this afternoon. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here in our great Parliament House and pay my respects. I also want to acknowledge the Evans family. Sam and Amy, thank you very much for being here today. The Clerk of the Senate and his team, many of whom I've worked with over a very long period of time in some very challenging committee inquiries, I must say. And to my former colleagues and friends, Claire Moore and Rachel Siewert, you're absolutely right, Claire. It is a special joy to be here with you both today. One thing that the three of us did together before I joined the ministry was quite a lot of work in Indigenous affairs through the committee system, and I'm immensely proud of some of the outcomes of that work over time. Harry Evans was the clerk for the first 12 years of my role here as a senator. So I certainly got to know him very well, and mostly on the upside. I didn't get into trouble that much, but it was certainly a good way to start a Senate career with such a legendary person in the role of clerk. I knew of his robust reputation amongst senators from my time as an advisor with Robert Hill, then opposition leader in the Senate for some years. The Senate committee system, which we've been asked to reflect on today, I think is simultaneously one of the greatest strengths and most irritating aspects of the Senate at the same time. And it kind of depends on where you're sitting at any point in your career as to how you find it. Immensely strong and incredibly important, or immensely irritating from time to time. So if you're on a government front bench or an opposition front bench or a government backbench or an opposition backbench or in a minor party where you can't necessarily get what you want, it can be frustrating. And so you get very different perspectives over time, and I think I spent long enough here to get all perspectives possible in terms of at least it being in a major party. When I came here as a government backbencher in 1997, Robert Hill was the leader of the coalition in the Senate, and I was really enthusiastic to get started in my committee work. I mean, I'd always wanted to be a senator, and I'd been successful on my fourth pre-selection at that point. So I came through the door wanting to be on Legal and Con, or Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, or the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. That just seemed all terribly logical to me. And then I was asked to do a dental inquiry in community affairs. So I know how you felt, Claire, in terms of that process. And that is not at all to disparage or to dismiss the importance of the work of community affairs. And in fact, the irony of that starting point is that it was a really important learning experience for me. On a couple of levels. First of all, my coalition colleagues did not welcome me to that committee. I remember them deserting me on hearing day one and going off for lunch together, two blokes, and excluding me from that. And I had to be rescued by my friends from the Labor Party that day. But also a real eye-opener on the fundamentals of those social policy issues which go to the heart of the well-being of our community so often. So I thank Robert Hill for that in retrospect, but I was quite dirty on him at the time. As Richard said, that eventually followed with a role on the Legal and Constitutional Committees, ultimately also on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. The period of time in which I was involved in the Legal and Constitutional Committee led to some very compelling committee inquiries, not the least of which was our legislative response in Australia with a very broad tranche of legislation to the 9/11 attacks. That was a phenomenal time in terms of the transformation of intelligence and law enforcement and a whole range of other aspects of our day-to-day operations as governments. And there was a lot of pressure on the committee at the time to just do what the government was asking for. I was never very good at that. And I was not very good at it on that occasion as well. In fact, I remember a senior cabinet minister saying to me, and this will, I think, ring true to Claire and to Rachel, perhaps to Rosemary and others, you can do this legislative review in a half-day hearing on a Friday at the end of a sitting week. That's what the government wants. So about 6 weeks later, with hearings across the country in as many venues as we could find to enable Australians to engage on that legislation. We returned, I thought, a very good report at the time. The mandatory sentencing of juvenile offenders legislation and bill, the Northern Territory legislation in particular, was another area in which I remember being told by a senior House of Reps colleague when I was wrestling with the sorts of recommendations that we would make in that inquiry with my colleagues, if I remember correctly, former Senator Brett Mason and former Senator Nigel Scullion, that I had not come here to be popular, I'd come here to do the right thing. And he was right, and so we recommended accordingly, and I was not popular. Certainly not in the government, and certainly not with the Northern Territory government at the time. And the process of bringing colleagues with you from your own party and from other parties who are part of the committee process, that is immensely important to the effective operation of our committee system on inquiries such as that. And I value the friendships over many years that I formed with chairs and deputy chairs, respectively, from the Labor Party and from the Greens over time in that committee process. Bringing them home was another one where I wrestled with my colleagues to bring them with me in terms of recommendations and for good outcomes, and it was incredibly important to do that. It's interesting, after 26 and a half years here, that there are still pieces of evidence and certain witnesses that you will never forget, that I will never forget. And the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade inquiry into military justice, references inquiry into military justice in this country, was one of those. I will never forget the grandfather who came to our hearing, I think in South Australia, in the Parliament in Adelaide, who came before us to give evidence in relation to live fire training exercises and how in the, probably by then the 21st century, how it was possible that the military was still engaged in live fire training exercises which could result in the death of his grandson. I'll never forget his evidence and that of his son and daughter-in-law that day. One of the most compelling committee experiences I have ever had. I didn't manage to persuade anyone to change their approach to live fire training, but nevertheless, it is one of those things that stays with you, and it's a very powerful opportunity for those individuals. The committee system, of course, can be a great opportunity for parenthetically ambitious members of an opposition to create their reputation and for government backbenchers to potentially limit their careers. Perversely, I think I did both as a government backbencher, which perhaps accounts in part for what was later described as my overnight meteoric 18-year rise to Defence Minister in 2015. I also have to say, and I've never done a count. I know a lot of public servants who have done a count about their appearances before estimates committees and how many times they've been over the years. I've never done a count of how many estimates hearings I participated in any of the roles on either side of the room. So as a chair or as a member of the committee, as a government chair, as a government backbencher, or an opposition chair, or as a minister, for that matter, answering questions for hours and hours and days and days. But it is, without doubt in my mind, one of the most effective parliamentary mechanisms I have observed in the world, no matter what seat you're sitting in that room. It is immensely powerful, and it's essential in my view that we absolutely preserve and enhance, if possible, wherever we can, that estimates process in the federal parliament. I said I made great friendships over many years, and a lot of those were with my Labor deputy chairs and colleagues, people like Jim McKiernan and Barney Cooney. I still have a beautiful pewter box engraved by Barney Cooney, which he gave to me in observation of my commitment to human rights in Australia. I still have that, and it was in my office every day of my parliamentary life until September 30 last year. It meant a great deal to me. Joe Ludwig, Chris Evans particularly in relation to military justice, they are relationships which were fundamental to the successful outcome of committee inquiries. Like Claire, I think one of the most important things of the committee system in this country and in this parliament is it gives a voice to those who have none. It doesn't cost anything to enable a witness to appear and to let them be heard on what might be the most important thing in their world. It is a vital part of our democracy. I mentioned that a Cabinet Minister told me at the time of the post-9/11 legislation to do a half-day Friday hearing, and I didn't listen. I think my capacity to ignore blandishments like that was an important part of me working within the committee system to make it as effective as possible. Didn't always help me in the end, but I was always very proud of the outcomes of our committee inquiries. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to reflect on the committee system. I wasn't expecting to stand up in Parliament 12 months after I left and speak again in any capacity. But it's a system that is perhaps arcane to many. But to me, it is the vital, muscular strength of the Senate and more strength to its arm. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Marise. Our final speaker is Rachel Siewert, who was a Senator for Western Australia from 2004 to 2021. During that time, Senator Siewert served on various committees, joint, select, standing committees. She was the chair of the Community Affairs References Committee for 12 years, initiated many inquiries during this time. She was also the whip for the Australian Greens as the party grew in numbers and factions. No, anyway, leave that alone. She is currently, she's currently Deputy CEO of the Western Australian Council of Social Service. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Siewert.
Hi everybody, thank you Richard. Kaya, that's hello in the Noongar language for the Whadjuk Noongar people from where I reside. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we are standing at the moment. And I'd also like to say hello to Sam and Amy. Thank you, Harry Evans' son. Thank you for coming, and hello to all of you. Harry Evans, as it said in the flyer, was a fierce defender of the Senate, champion of the value of parliamentary democracy, and he played an absolutely key role in the formation and the shaping of the modern committee system. During the debate on the establishment of the modern Senate committee system, or the Senate system, in 1970, all those years ago, senators took part in the 5 hours of debate. That may seem like a long time, but for those that participated in the, what were they calling it, hashtag sleepless in the Senate, and for all those Senate long overnight debates, it really wasn't that long when you compare it to that. But during that time, Senator Ian Wood was moved to exclaim, "I believe that whatever proposition is accepted ultimately, the Parliament and the people will say when they look back on this occasion that this has been the greatest event and the greatest day in any parliamentary history." And while it may not have been the greatest event in parliamentary history, I can think of many, it certainly was a very significant time, one that I do see as being very, very important. It will probably come as no surprise to people that I am an extremely strong supporter of the committee system and agree with Claire and Marise that it was the most important part of the work I did for many reasons. And I agree with the comment of Ian and of Harry, is that it is a fundamental part of democracy in Australia, I believe, for many reasons. I'm supposed to be giving my personal experience and reflections, and as I said, it is my favourite part of the Senate, and I believe, and of the Parliament, I believe plays a very important role. The committee brings the community into the workings of the Parliament. It takes the Parliament to the community. I've sat in committee inquiries in this place, in other state parliaments, surrounded by the books and Hansards of that parliament. I've sat in local government offices, but most importantly, I've sat in community, under trees, in sheds, literally. I've been in committee inquiries from Kununurra to Tasmania to the Tiwi Islands and to the Torres Strait, all to hear from members of the community who have brought their personal experiences to bring to bear on decision making. That is why I think it's so important. Some of the other things that it delivers is it puts issues on the agenda. People can come in and share their issues. It brings, as I said, the community into the parliament and the parliament to the community. Community engagement and people's real life accounts are so important. Richard, can I just say, I could talk under wet cement about committee systems, so please tell me when I'm getting to time. There's a reason why I talk about accounts and not stories, and that is when we go to the forced adoption inquiry, which Claire was a key member of that inquiry. It partly came out of the work that, in fact, Claire was talking about forgotten Australians, but also from the work of particularly the mothers that were subject to forced adoption, and particularly in my home state of Western Australia, where people may be aware there was an apology by the state parliament given. However, there was still much to do at a national level in terms of forced adoptions. That inquiry will stay in my heart and my mind forever. And I will always remember, and I'm sure Claire remembers this, we were in fact sitting in a committee room in the New South Wales Parliament, surrounded by those Hansards that I mentioned earlier. And a lady had shared her experience for the very first time of forced adoptions and what happened to her. And I, as chair, said, "Thank you very much for sharing your story." And she instantly came back and said, "This is not a story, this is an account of my life." And she's right. And since then, I've tried to honour that comment and do not call people's experiences stories. They are accounts. And so I agree with Marise. Things people say in inquiries stick with you and you carry it in your heart. I should also say that we hear as senators, or we did hear as senators, people's accounts, deeply traumatic accounts in many instances, and they live with you and they do sit heavily when you know and you hear of people's accounts of their experiences. Another one was inquiry that sits with me very heavily also is the inquiry into MESH. And that we heard many traumatic accounts there, but it was not just the accounts, it was actually seeing the women that couldn't sit in a chair for very long, and in fact couldn't sit before us on the panel. They had to stand up against a wall because they could not sit for very long. So not only did we hear their accounts, we saw the physical impact of MESH on those women. That's why it's so important for us to be out there to see people's lived experience and to hear people's lived experience. I've also got to say that the research that the committee, and I pay my respects and support for the committee staff, their research, their quality of the work is outstanding and second to none. And I always listened to the research and paid attention to the research when we were being told about the research. It could also bring, the committees also bring parties together. I remember sitting in, I'm sure Claire does too, sitting in Alice Springs at another hearing, and during lunchtime we were talking about the draft for the forced adoptions. And it was almost like we were competing to see who could make the strongest suggestions for recommendations, and we were in agreement. There was no disagreement other than, yes, we need to strengthen this recommendation and how far should we go. Those committees are very important for bringing parties together. I've had occasions where we tabled a report, I think it was with 4 separate reports, and so that also happens, but it does mean that all those opinions get offered to the community and to our fellow parliamentarians to see why we were arguing particular points. People, as I also articulated, share accounts that they have never heard before, which I think is an honour for the Senate to hear those accounts. Importantly, Senate committee inquiries actually lead to outcomes. It may take quite a while sometimes, but they do. The Royal Commissions I can think of. Claire named one, but of course there's also the Robodebt inquiry. Robodebt inquiry, we had an initial inquiry, then we established another inquiry, and it was ongoing. In fact, when I left the Senate, I was very pleased when the Royal Commission was announced because it holds the system accountable. It also led to apologies. Senate inquiries, again, Claire named one, but we've had also the apology to those affected by forced adoptions. We also saw the Royal Commission partly coming out of the Senate inquiry we did into the treatment of people with disability in institutional settings. If you remember, there was a Four Corners report on the lived experience of people with disability that were subject to abuse in institutional settings. There was a call then for a Royal Commission. The government wouldn't call a Royal Commission, so we held a Senate inquiry. And of course then, later down the track, there was a Royal Commission. They're still implementing those recommendations. Again, the outcomes and the process of the Senate committees. I don't want to forget to mention the role of estimates. And the role of estimates is so important for finding out information. Again, it opens up scrutiny of the government. It enables you to get really rich information and also helps sometimes in understanding of why a decision has been made. You can put lists of questions on notice and you select the ones that you want to actually ask. But also, it's a really good process for getting data, some data that government refuses to release. And so I'm letting out a little secret here, although I'm sure people knew what was going on. But community and community-based organisations would say, could you ask for the data on blah, 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 blah? And I would duly ask for the information on blah, 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 blah. But then I learnt that this is taking up a whole lot of my estimates time just asking for data. And so I would put them on notice. But then we got Community Affairs and the Department of Social Services. They then agreed to actually provide at each estimates the information that we wanted. So, for example, on the Northern Territory intervention, there was a lot of data that we needed. They ended up tabling at the beginning of each estimates the information that they knew that I would be asking for, which was data on the impact and things like that. It was the same with employment, where we used to ask a whole lot of questions about, and it'll come as no surprise, the number of people that had been suspended as a result of what I still believe is a very punitive approach to those on income support. So we got to the point where we could get that data and then we could ask questions about the data, which was, of course, the important thing also was what's underlying the number of people, for example, that were being suspended from payment. That's why I think that estimates is so important. It gives you access to information, also lets the community ask through their senator for information. Other committees that I think are really important is the select committee process. Sometimes I think, I must admit, it's slightly overused for Senate committees, and I'm sure I know for a fact that the committee staff find it quite hard work when there's so many, or very intense, I should say, when there's so many select committees, but they do play a role. I'd also touch on the COVID committee, which I was a member of. Katie Gallagher was chair at the time. That, I think, a very important process because as the country was in a crisis, very hard decisions were being made, important decisions, but that also needed to be subject to scrutiny. So that was as decisions were being made, that committee could scrutinise and ask questions about that process, which enabled the community to, I think, understand a bit better why those decisions were being made and what was behind those decisions. I now sit, before I came into Parliament, I gave evidence to Senate committees, then I was chair and participated in, I don't know if anyone's counted, but a lot of hearings. And I now am again back on the other side of the table giving evidence to Senate committees and writing submissions. I want this process to keep going. As I said, the committee, I touched on the Senate committee staff who are fantastic, do excellent research. The Senate committee process couldn't function without the dedicated staff that support those committees. Finally, part of the process, of course, with committees is the government responding to those committees. Most of the time I was pretty unhappy with the responses. Of course, I was pleased when they said, yes, they're going to implement it. It was usually the low-hanging fruit, but that also gives people another hook to raise the issues again. Because what you're always looking for is how can you then progress the issue, that whatever issue that the committee was about, how can you keep progressing that because you want to achieve outcomes? None of us would refer an issue to a committee inquiry if there wasn't really important reason to do it. Legislation committees likewise are very important and provide, I think, important scrutiny of legislation in many instances, and the committees that I've had experience with, we did make recommendations about amendments or through minority reports. It is also a really important process. I think I'm probably gone over time. Thank you for inviting me to talk about something that's extremely close to my heart. Long live the Senate committee process, and also long live it being separated. Legislations and references. I lived through that time, that short period of time where they were together. It was a mess. We need legislation and references. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for sharing your experiences and reflections on the Senate committee process. We're about to move to questions, and I invite our speakers to come to the panel setting and grab some water on the way through if you feel you need it. Could you please put your hand up if you have a question? There are roving microphones. I think on an occasion like this, it's important to identify that if they wish to, the former senators can ask questions of each other. I think that's always a very revealing thing. And I'll just stand up here and keep out of everyone's way. We have a gentleman here with a question.
Thank you very much. Is that on? So I'm interested to see if the panel's got any thoughts about the Queensland situation. Queensland famously abolished its upper house, and therefore I'm assuming it has a fair while ago. So I'm assuming it doesn't have much of a robust Senate sort of estimates equivalent, or does it? How does it all work?
I don't think it works as well as it could, but they do have the process. It follows the same methodology where they have the estimates process, where they have the government being able to be called to account around budget issues, and that's quite the same system operates. They do have a fairly vibrant system of issues-based committees as well. I've read some great Queensland reports. There was a brilliant one they did on mental illness and the focus on mental illness, which linked into a committee we were doing here. But they work on the same model, and I think the parliaments all across the country do. They actually have the same kind of process, which shows that linkage between decision makers and community is absolutely critical to actually having any kind of relationship and putting the issues out there. So, but, you know, I'm a bit biased. I kind of think that it might be nice, and it's almost a treasonable offence in Queensland to say bring back the upper house.
It's been, what, nearly 102 years since they abolished the upper house or something like that? If I might be so bold, one of the one of the benefits of having a strong and well-identified estimates process in the federal parliament is that it becomes almost compulsory for the state and territory parliaments to follow suit. And during the period of time that Rachel talked about, where the legislation and references committees were bashed back together during the years that the coalition had a one-seat majority in the Senate, one thing that was never taken away was the estimates process. It was seen as so central to the way in which the parliament operated that that remained in place and remained a really strong accountability mechanism throughout that time. I can't actually see any hands because of the lights, but if people with microphones see people with hands, then please. Oh, Dr. Rosemary Lang has a question. I hope it's a very difficult and challenging one. Rosemary.
Thank you all for going through your accounts of your experiences on Senate committees. I was in the background for all of them, in fact. My question is to you, Marise. You mentioned you had ideas for improving estimates, and given that it is such a lost the word, but that happens when you retire. Yeah. Essential part of the inquiry process. From the point of view of perhaps not a minister, how would you improve estimates?
So I think it's an interesting question for a number of reasons, and it kind of goes to the first gentleman's question about what the states and territories do. In New South Wales, for example, you don't. It's not just upper house ministers who participate in the estimates process. So portfolio ministers do attend the estimates committees, which are comprised of upper house members. But if you're a lower house minister, you still have to come and defend yourself, basically, and your decisions, and stand up for them and defend your budget and your spending and all that sort of thing. I think there's something to be said for that. And as somebody who has tried to wrangle portfolios for lower house ministers as a representing minister in the Senate, I'd love to put some of my former colleagues through their paces at an estimates committee over time. Because, of course, Senate ministers do have so many representing responsibilities. And you want to do a good job, right? So you work with the ministerial staff, you work with the agencies concerned to prepare yourself, if you're doing your job, to prepare yourself and to make sure that you can play an appropriate role. Other ministers choose not to do that, Senate ministers, and they say, not my problem. You know, there's 200 public servants here, they can deal with it. So there's two approaches. So I think there's some value in that. I think I don't know whether the rotation of the number of estimates from supplementary to additional to everything else, I don't know whether that's right. And because the secondary hearings are so constrained in time, would it be better to have just two sets of full fortnights and instead of trying to do little ones? I'm no longer a practitioner, so it's just just an observation. But and then I remember being told as a very, very junior senator how they used to deal with training Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade officials to come before an estimates committee. And if the question is, can you pass the salt? The answer is yes, but they don't do anything. They don't actually pass the salt, right? They don't go the next step in the answer to the question. This is a metaphor, obviously. And I thought, it was a very diplomatic metaphor though, right? And I thought to myself, that's what they do. That's what they were doing at the time. Is there an issue in relation to the effectiveness of Australia's development assistance in X country? Yes. And, why should a senator have to do that? It's not meant to be like that. So, anyway, a couple of ideas.
I think all agencies do Senate training, don't they?
By DFAT, I think. Yeah, DFAT does the training, right? Yeah. At times, that was to my benefit, by the way. For about 4 years.
Senator Moore.
One of the important things about the committees is it should never be about the senators. The committee's time should be mainly used by the witnesses to get their points across. And I think when the committees work best, it's when you read the Hansards, the senators are listening and they're actually getting information. And this may not be the case in Senate estimates all the time, but nonetheless in other committees, I think that's what's important. And the ones that really work is where you hear the voices of the people who've come to talk with the senators. Now, there are some occasions that I can remember where senators were deeply personally involved, and Andrew Murray, in those early hearings, it was his experience, and you could feel the interaction. Just reading the Senate estimates, reading the Senate Hansards, you can feel the interaction just by, I happened to do that before this. But another one I wanted to mention was the one we did on gynecological cancer, and the wonderful Jeannie Ferris was there all the way through, and her illness had been proceeding as we were doing the inquiry. She was very important in getting the inquiry up, but the inquiry, as always, it was so important and more people came, so we had extended dates. But Jeannie was there, and it was just wonderful to see her engagement in that process. And also, when we got to table that report, I was really keen that she got to bring the report into the Senate. And it's a beautiful speech that she made, and I think that's the exception when senators are part of it. But otherwise, the less said by senators, the better. And I don't know whether that's always, I don't know whether senators get trained, but I think that would be an important element to be.
To Claire's point, the chair, the capable chair, who says, "Is there a question there, Senator?"
Oh, absolutely.
As the monologue continues, is very important.
Yep.
Just as a sidebar, I'm going to be putting "the less senators say, the better" on a T-shirt, which will be available purchase in
Claire
the
Moore,
Parliament.
1 November 2024.
I'm happy to live with that.
I must admit, I'm appearing before estimates on Monday, so I'm taking notes. It's very, very important. I think we've got another question up here. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I actually work in the committee office on the rep side. I've worked in committees for a long time. I currently do work for a joint committee. I'm just curious what your thoughts might be about government responses to committees. I mean, often, you get responses and often you get agreement to recommendations, and pretty much the process then kind of ends as far as the committee is concerned often. Do you think, though, that long-term an agreement to a recommendation, there might be a role for committees to follow up post that? And do you think that sometimes those are used as kind of box-ticking exercises by governments to say, well, we've responded and we've agreed, and yeah, we'll get to it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think very often it's used by government as a box-ticking exercise unless they actually have decided they're going to do something and then they'll put it in there. I think, yes, there certainly there's an opportunity to respond to responses when they're tabled in the Senate, which a lot of us used to take the opportunity to do. To your question, yes, it would be good, I think, if committees did follow through some of the responses. In the past, some have. But, yeah, doing it more formally would probably be, I think, would be useful.
I think we probably have the technology now, in fact, just to establish a system for starters that automatically, reflexively notes whether things have been progressed or not, and to maintain a register, as it were, online of implementation of government responses. I think that would be a good idea.
In the time that I was working, I think I found one committee that got the government response within a short period of time. Sometimes it takes a while for the government responses to come through, which is very disappointing. But the one that did have that happen was around suicide in Australia, and it was an extraordinary committee process, and again, gut-wrenching in terms of the courage that people showed to come forward and give evidence at that inquiry. But that response from government came very, very quickly and was actually picked up on, and people noted that that, you know, there's almost an expectation that the government response may be delayed, and I think there is an opportunity for people to raise that more quickly and to keep asking questions about when it's going to come and reinforce those issues. And that did happen with the institutional care one, and that, I think that really was instrumental in getting action taken. But I think that system would be really good, Marise, to actually ensure that it's brought before the whole process together. Yeah, it'd be great. The other thing is, when you mention you're from the House, I don't think there's enough discussion between the House committees and the Senate committees. I think that's one of the issues that we noted in the Senate process, that one of the first items of business of any Senate inquiry should be what's gone before on this issue. So you actually have a library search immediately as you start that committee of previous committees that have looked at the same issue across the House and the Senate, because I think that's a missed opportunity. And sometimes we've even had concurrent inquiries on similar topics going on between the House and the Senate, and that's just a matter of the people ticking off and working better together, and I think there's an opportunity for that.
I just know we don't have a lot of time, but both Claire and Rachel, and me to a much lesser extent, have mentioned really sensitive, difficult issues that have been considered in the committee context. And I wanted to echo Rachel's views about the value of the committee staff and the extraordinary professionalism that they bring to their jobs, often under huge workload pressures, particularly. But also, I remember Legal and Con did. Jackie will tell me, but Legal and Con did something like 20 inquiries in a calendar year of very substantive legislation ones. But when they are these emotional and very personal things, it takes a real toll on the committee staff as well. In military justice, we lost witnesses who took their own lives before the date of their hearing. We found afterwards witnesses had taken their own lives, that sort of thing. And to do an inquiry into suicide, similar into forced adoptions, all those sorts of things, it's so important that the committee staff are given the professional support that they need. They're dealing with these people every day as witnesses that they need to support themselves in their own workplace.
Thank you all. I think we do have time for one last question, and I see one hand, which is a good ratio.
Hi, thank you for the accounts you've given of your experiences as former senators. Noting the previous comment just quickly about the Secretariat, my question was about the relationship between senators and the Secretariat. Obviously, the Secretariat immediate function is to fulfill senators and, by extension, the committee's functions as a mechanism of accountability in Australian democracy. But I was wondering whether you, as former senators, had any particular insights in the Secretariat's function as that mechanism, beyond just fulfilling the committee's immediate duties, such as inquiries, processing of submissions, etc.
I'm not sure I understand that question. So, insights into what role for the Secretariat? Is that they are immensely knowledgeable people, and many of them actually are so experienced. But I'm just trying. I don't want to miss the intent of your question.
So, the reason being that I'll give very quick context. My academic studies were in anthropology, and I find the culture of the Secretariat, because it is quite an invisible force, as the committee is often seen, I think, publicly as like the senators and their the issues that they bring to the fore. But being such an invisible force, there must be some kind of relationship there. There must be some kind of something beyond just the automation or the completion of, yes, we're going to, complete these submissions, we're going to organize these hearings. And you've spoken about, I think it was you, former Senator Moore, about how the committee the Secretariat and the staff have guided or protected the committee. And I wanted just sort of a further explanation or exploration of that.
So I think a chair and a deputy chair always have an important relationship with the committee secretary and the senior staff within the particular Secretariat. If, for example, before you start the inquiry, there's going to be a research paper produced by the Secretariat, then you want to make sure, the Secretary always, in my experience, wants to make sure that she or he is on point for what the committee wants to explore. And how that should be prepared. And if that relationship isn't there, or if there's ships that are passing in the night, then that actually causes dysfunction in the committee process. You also have to have that very effective relationship to prepare a cogent and competent report. And if you don't have it, then what you might end up with at the end of your committee process is your secretary saying, well, Senator, here's your draft report, and it's got, 12, 15, 20 recommendations, and you look at that and you go, I don't agree with any of these. How did we get to this point? So you must make sure that that is effectively functioning. I have always encouraged, in my time as a committee chair, other senators to engage with the Secretariat as well. And the other thing that happens, and both Claire and Rachel did this a lot more than I did because I became a minister, but you spend so much time on the road with your secretary and their team, or small numbers of their team. It's not like we're taking, a circus on the road, but you spend so much time on the road. You go to isolated and remote parts of Australia. You do all the capital cities. You also want to have a good personal relationship so that works effectively too. I don't know if that goes to your question, but they're the thoughts that come to mind.
And during the inquiry, you're also picking up the sense, you're discussing the evidence that you hear, so that then develops the flavour of where we're going to be heading as a committee. We certainly then, we try and sit down and see what are the key areas, key issues you want to articulate in the report. You then sit down and discuss, the draft. And then, and as Marise said, you get a flavour for where the other senators are going. And sometimes, as we all know, you don't always get an agreement in an inquiry, and so there can be minority reports or dissenting reports, but that comes out as the committee is progressing, as the hearings are progressing. That you try and make sure that you're picking out the major issues as you go along, and as you have more hearings, those issues then may become more prominent. And you can tell by the questions that we're asking, or that we were asking, in terms of where some of those major issues are.
And the report has got to reflect the evidence, so that people who had gone to the trouble of putting in submissions and appearing before the committee needs to see that the final report reflects that. And we will have different opinions coming through with evidence. So particularly the experienced Secretariat really know how to structure a report effectively, so that people will be able to pick up a report now that was done years ago and get a real feel for what was the intent of the committee, what was the evidence taken, and where did it go, and did the recommendations reflect what the text says in the report? Because it would be nonsensical if you come up with a series of recommendations that are not reflected in the text of the committee. And when you actually go onto the Senate website to see what's there, if you are really interested, that Hansard is so brilliant and so revealing when you see what you've said, actually, which is a bit concerning. But you actually see all the submissions are there. It's a brilliant resource, and I'm constantly referring people to it, to go onto the website. Every piece of evidence which is available to be public, because we said some of them are confidential, some of the submissions because of the sensitivity, but everything that's been said is there on record for someone who wants to seek it out. So you own that, so that every hearing is recorded, every piece of evidence is recorded, the tabling speeches are recorded if you're really desperate, but in terms of the process, that is the body of work that goes on. And when you have a chance to look at them and you see the history, you see people's personalities coming out in that process, and you actually benefit so much and see what was the worthwhile nature of that particular issue. And we owe that to the people who've come to us to give their evidence to us.
Thank you, Senators. One thing I'd add in relation to that question is that there's really strong provisions in our standing orders, in some of the other orders that the Senate has made, in guidance material for committee staff and others to ensure that the decision-making in relation to committee work rests in the hands of the chair and the members of the committee. Yep. So there's strong guidance and a strong culture in our committee office and in the committee office in the House of Reps to ensure that it is the Senator's report, the members' report, and that the work of the Secretariat is supporting the ability of marvellous senators like the ones we have here today to synthesise the evidence that's come before them and produce really compelling material. On that note, I shouldn't have the last word, that's terrible. But can I again thank all of our panel members for sharing their experiences with us today. Claire Moore, Marise Payne, Rachel Siewert. And that concludes our formal proceedings and the 2024 lecture series. So I wanted to thank all the esteemed speakers we've had all through the year, and I hope that all of you will join us again next year. Thank you very much.